It's good evening. It's 7 o'clock. It's actually 7:01, and welcome to Know Before You Grow, a subcommittee of Petaluma Urban Chat. I'm Dan Like, and as always, many thanks to Dave Alden and Sharon Kirk for doing the actual work while I get to sit here and chat. A couple housekeeping notes before we get terribly started. Oh yeah, I was going to offer as my intro that we're Petaluma, California, a city that has declared a climate emergency in a state where the governor of California has just offered up what appears to be a subsidy of roughly 8 tons of CO2 per vehicle. So I'm a little bit in high dudgeon this evening. Coming up on April 27th, we have a forum on housing, the missing middle, talking about house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. Tomorrow, at noon, we will have lunch at Aquas Cafe, where we will talk about these things in person. If you are interested in getting involved, we'd love to have you there to chat. If you just want to figure out what's going on in the city, we'd love to have you there to chat. We have been Zoom bombed. We will be Zoom bombed again. If things get weird, hang loose and we'll restart after we kick out the miscreants. If you're trying to join the meeting late and I have turned on the room, please respond to the chat questions. It's always been a little weird. We have participants who are subject to the Brown Act and have concerns about serial public meetings. We respect their opinions if they don't want to get involved, and we leave it to their judgment. Let's see, what's the other thing that I was going to catch here was, oh, yes, we're leaving the chat open again. Let's keep the chat focused on giving me and Teddy Herzog, who has coordinated our speaker this evening, a little focus on questions. I like to keep it on topic and not too distracting for me because I'm trying to follow the presentation. With that, I would like to turn the mic over to Mike McGinn, Executive Director of America Walks, former mayor of Seattle, who's going to chat with us tonight. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I actually prepared a slideshow. Let me see if I can share my screen.
You should be able to share.
Is the olive oil out in the storage?
And whoever that was, you might want to mute yourself if I can figure out to mute you first.
How are we doing? Is that up now?
I see it. It looks great.
It is.
Yeah, that's our new logo. We redid our website. And, I just want to say before going in, I've asked about who the audience was and what they might be interested in. I'll see if I hit the mark or not, and I'll try to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm also not really an expert on anything. I was just thinking about this. I'm really a generalist. I was a lawyer in private practice who was also very active in the Sierra Club, working on trying to elect good people to office and get good policies passed at the state, regional, and city level. And then I was working in my own neighborhood on trying to get sidewalks for my neighborhood. I quit my job as a lawyer and founded a nonprofit that was focused on the topics that are the pillars of the Know Before You Grow organization. How do you build, really vital places that meet our equity and climate and economic concerns and quality of life concerns in Seattle, and that led me to run for mayor. So I've had experience on kind of different pieces of the puzzle, and I have ways of looking at things, and I'm exposed to lots of information, but I don't want to portray myself as an expert in any of these. I'm a generalist, but I think that engaged generalists are good for a city, and I think that's the crowd I'm in. So with that intro and those caveats, I've been really fortunate to be asked to be the executive director of America Walks. I've been in the job about a year and a half now. I guess we're getting to 2 years now. It's about 25 years old. Our mission is kind of twofold. It's to support local advocacy, give them the resources they need to try to make better places, more inclusive, equitable, and accessible places, and to be a voice for walkability at a national level. And we occupy a unique role. We have lots of partners at the national level, but that focus on walkability is uniquely ours of all the national organizations. And I invite you to go to americawalks.org and check out our materials and give us suggestions on things we could do better. And who knows, maybe even become a member if you're inspired. I went and zoomed in to the Petaluma zoning map. I got some great videos, and I was kind of struck. I don't know why it made me think of this, but on the right, that's South Bend, Indiana. And that's from Tool Design, who did a downtown street design for South Bend when Pete Buttigieg was mayor. So, here's a before picture of one of the streets, and here's an after picture of one of the streets. And Pete's really proud of the work he did on those streets. It was one of the reasons he became head of USDOT. So to anybody who becomes mayor of Petaluma, if you do a really great plan, you too might end up the head of USDOT one day. So, if you're ambitious, make a great walkable place. Having said that, I know that California is done better on other places, but what I want to talk about first is just this idea of how do we measure our places? How do we look at how our places are performing? And I think those of us that have been working in this area know that for too long, we've measured streets by the number of vehicles that move through the streets and how fast they move. And it was known as level of service. And California is actually a leader in trying to leave level of service behind. So if we're not going to use level of service, and I'm sure the Department of Transportation is proposing some things, but I just want to share some information to think about what we're trying to accomplish. I was really struck by Andrew Price. He's got a blog. He wrote something called Places and Non-Places. And I'm going to mention that one first because it's really intuitive. And it's really goes to the heart of walkability too. So his thing is he defines, if you look at a town or a city or a neighborhood, what are the places there? And places are obviously homes, stores, places to relax. He has parks and gardens, plazas, human-oriented streets as outdoor places. And non-places are the spaces between. And there's a couple of really important distinctions here. You'll notice he puts roads in. So some roads are places, some roads are streets where people gather. I'll meet you at the corner of 3rd and Main, or I'll meet you on the sidewalk in front of this coffee shop. That's a place. But the edge of the freeway isn't a place, or the edge of a really fast road isn't a place. He also has a distinction here between parks and green spaces, which I found really interesting. Nobody says, let's meet at the strip of grass between the parking lot and the boulevard down by, the Target, on the edge of town. That's not a place. But they will say, I'll meet you by the swings at the local park, which has a name. So that's really a good test of whether something's a place or not. Does it have a name? If it has a name, it's a place. So then he went into different places, and the blue are the places and the red are the non-places. So that's a San Francisco neighborhood, and the ratio of place to non-place is really high. This is downtown Phoenix. Downtown Phoenix actually has a downtown, and it's actually not bad. Parking lots aren't places, right? That's not a destination. They're the space between places. And then this could be anywhere, on a freeway. And reason I like it is it's so intuitive. You can't walk around this last one. The places are too far apart, and there aren't enough places. So it kind of brings us back to that zoning map, doesn't it? Right? Does our zoning allow, it's not just about traffic then, it's also about the zoning. Are we designing our town, our community to be full of places or not? So that's both parking minimums, which will give you a lot of non-places. It's the design of the street itself, as we spoke about. It's what we dedicate in the street, how wide are the sidewalks and things like that. But it's also what uses do we allow? Will we allow corner stores in a neighborhood? Will we allow more people in the neighborhood? What level of setbacks do we require? And this is just, I think to me, it's very intuitive because what we know about walkable places is they're placeful. There's tons of destinations very close to each other. Now, by the way, if you really want to dig more into what makes a place walkable, I want to invite you to come to our next webinar. Larry Frank is a researcher in this area. He has decades of research, really pulling out all of the factors that make a place walkable. And I won't attempt to do his presentation here, but they have data. You know, they can take a look at the transportation system. They can take a look at the land use. They can take a look at the pedestrian environment, green spaces, and that will tell you how much people walk. They can also take a look at the exposures people have to deal with, whether it's noise or pollution or the like. They can actually measure health impacts of that and what that means for disease. So this is yet another way to measure. Like oftentimes you've seen the Texas Transportation Institute give levels of congestion for a place, or we use measures of delay as whether or not we should invest in a new piece of road infrastructure. Well, here's what they can do. They can look at the built environment, they can model the activity, they can figure out how much more illness there will be, apply the cost of that illness, and come up with an entirely different metric. Here's an example that he shared with me. They can measure how much more diabetes they'll have in a community based on one transportation plan versus another. So these are much more sophisticated tools. We are still using the time delay in so many cost-benefit analyses. These are tools that cities could, or towns could potentially use, and you can measure and categorize the improved health benefits of creating a walkable place, given the amount of additional walking and physical activity that would occur in that place. So it's really fascinating. You know, come to the webinar, learn more, and we can all learn more about how to start getting this used to actually do the right cost-benefit analyses for places. Here's another measurement that those who follow Strong Towns, and I know at least a couple of people do, which is a measurement of the economic value of creating places that have really great place to non-place ratios. Like, again, we can add this up. And this slide just shows the cost per acre, or excuse me, the taxes per acre of different types of development. It's done by an outfit called Urban 3. It's run by Joe Minicozy. I really recommend going to their website and digging into it deeper. But this example is a downtown building in Asheville, North Carolina, in the Walmart. And what you can see is that a little bit of acreage produces a lot more taxes. And what we know from this is when you look at a town, you can almost always see where the downtown is or where the denser places are. This one goes a little bit further. You know, the arrows go, the bars going up are the revenue in places, or actually it's the net revenue, because in this one, they actually looked at the expense of supporting different places. And what they found was that the places that had the business districts, that had apartment buildings, that had a high density of uses, more than generated enough taxes to pay for the costs of the infrastructure to support it. And the places where the destinations were separated from each other, there were a lot of parking lots, a lot of roads, more pipes, they didn't generate the taxes to support themselves. And it's just a fascinating analysis. And if you're, as I was, an elected official in a city looking at a budget shortfall, it was 2010, the midst of the recession, the idea of raising taxes or cutting expenses didn't sound good. But being able to generate more tax revenue by creating a more vibrant city was a great idea. And the best way to do that is actually really granular, walkable places. That's what this shows. It's not the big It's not the thing on the edge of town. It's the small businesses, the medium businesses, and it's the apartment buildings too. And I know this is controversial, but we oftentimes think that bringing a new apartment building into a town is somehow or another going to put a burden on the town. But there's already a road. There's probably already water pipes. You may have to make some adjustments, but you've actually just added a lot more people to help support the local businesses and help support the budget of the city, and share the load. So economic vitality takes you to this place as well. Obviously, climate, we should measure by climate. Transportation is now 29% of all emissions. It's the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions nationwide. This is from this is from the EPA website. Electric cars are great, but if we're serious about making reductions fast, we also have to make sure we're creating the opportunities for walking, biking, and transit in these places. And since I'm from America Walks, I really have to talk about the pedestrian safety crisis. Even if I weren't, I should probably have to talk about it. This is from 2021, looking at data through 2019. And the data from the last 2 years is even worse. The number of pedestrian deaths continues to rise every year on our streets across the nation. And, you know, just a little bit on the disparate impacts. You know, it's older adults are more disproportionately affected. It's people walking in low income areas. They tend to have the streets going through their neighborhood. Well, they walk more, number one. The streets going through their neighborhoods are wider and faster and more dangerous, and probably have fewer safe crossings as well. And that's also shown with respect to race and ethnicity. You know, Black and Native Americans both are disproportionately affected by the crisis. And there's a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest we know is speed. And I'm sure many of you have seen this graph before. If hit by a car traveling at 20 miles an hour, you have a 5% chance of dying, and that's significant. But hit by a car moving at 40 miles an hour, it's an 85% chance. So one of the most important things you can do for safety is design streets in which people move slower. And I know Petaluma has been doing that, you know, bringing the road safety redesigns and narrowing of lanes and the like, you know, through the places where people walk the most. But this is something you really have to look at in any places where people are present, you know, slowing the cars down to a point at which they can see and drivers can see and recognize pedestrians and take action in the length of time required to reduce the severity of an accident if one occurs. It's something about the human body and vision and our ability to see things that at high speeds, our vision narrows and our ability to really see and understand what's happening on the edges of the roadway decrease dramatically. It's why on the highway, the signs are so big. They have to be, right? Whereas, as you know, you can come up, if you're rolling slow, up to a four-way intersection and take a look around and make some decisions and wave people through. And again, it's the slow speeds make a huge difference. And they also make a huge difference towards making a place, the kind of place where other users can enjoy it, right? Because it doesn't feel so hostile. So, you know, this is a picture you'll see a lot. It's a Wikimedia Commons picture. I see it all over the place because it shows bike and walking and transit. And a street like this isn't actually possible unless the vehicles are also moving more slowly, right? That allows for the types of interactions between all users that feel safe and comfortable. And I guess the other reason I put it in is because, and that's my project in Seattle, and I'm pretty proud of it. We actually had the buses stop in lane. Right? You may not be able to pick this up, and it was controversial, but just up the hill is 99. Just down the hill is another street called Westlake. Both of those are higher capacity streets than this one. And on this street, the buses stop in lane, the cars wait behind. And that made more room to allow the protected bike lane And we see here the islands with the bus stops where people can wait more comfortably and not have to deal with the bicyclists. So I'm not going to go into all the different ways one can narrow a street or make it calmer, but it really is important to emphasize that slowing the vehicles down to a point where they can interact well with people, other users of the street, is really critical. I'm stealing this line. I think it's from Gil or Enrique Penalosa. You know, cars are like your in-laws. You want to have good relations with them, but you don't want them to run your life. So that's the relationship to vehicles in cities. You want to have a good relation, but you can't let them run the city. Now, this is where we get to a little bit more of the process. I was looking at different ways to measure, like what is success or not. Because I think that one of the things that's, been disturbing to lots of folks is that so much of our city design has been driven by, in the past, and thankfully this is changing, and we're seeing a dramatic change in the traffic engineering profession, but it's been driven by the design of the streets, and the streets have been driven by the number of vehicles moving down the streets. I was talking with someone and he shared this insight with me. In a city, in a city, if you want to get something done, as between elected officials, the public, and agency officials, you have to get 2 out of 3. And that was, I thought about that from my own experience as mayor. There were actually times I wanted to do things as mayor. And you think as mayor of a city, and we didn't have a city manager. I was a chief executive of the city. You think you have power, but you discover that power is shared in a setting. But if I didn't have the agency with me and there wasn't a public demand, then I was taking a risk and asking for something to be done, it turns out. I think that agency officials, may sometimes claim that, look, we're just trying to do what the elected officials tell us or the like. But if you think about how our system works, the public elects people, to represent them, to make the decisions. And so they're giving to them, the exercise of their judgment and their discretion and their thoughtfulness in making decisions. And then the elected officials do the same to agency officials. And that judgment and discretion and institutional knowledge is a source of power in the system. And, really needs to be, so I would say to people trying to create change, I find this an extremely useful thing. Now, none of these areas are monolithic, right? Like the public is certainly not monolithic, but you need a substantial number of the public if you want to get somewhere. Elected officials don't all agree, but if you want to get something done, you probably need a champion or two. And even in agencies, there are multiple agencies in play. So one thing to think about is, as an advocate or an actor within the system in any one of those spaces, who are your potential allies in those spaces? We're all familiar with the fire chief who says we need a wider street for the trucks to get through. But perhaps there's a public health official who can help share this information about the health benefits of walkability. And that person should be at the table as well to talk about what should be done. Who's getting involved as members of the public or advocacy, as to who should be in agency positions. Being part of the selection committee is another thing to think about. Working to educate folks there as well. And I think in the transportation field, we've just, for a variety of reasons, conceded more power over on the agency side. Now, having said that, I would say, I remember in Seattle, my DOT folks would come forward and they say, okay, this bike lane is in the plan. Do you want to go ahead with it, Mayor? Like they checked with me on all bike plans, which was very interesting because they understood that they actually didn't have the full power. And they certainly didn't have the full power because because the public there'd probably be some level of backlash. And I would say, go ahead. And, they'd keep coming back and check with me. And this was when I was the new mayor. And I realized it was because they'd had the experience before of wanting to go ahead and having an elected official change their mind because of the public response. So they're cautious and they understand the need for, having some substantial portion of the other two areas along, even though so much of street design, because of the legal rules set up around it and the exposure to liability and the need to have an engineer sign off on things, even though so much of the authority appears to have been given to them, even it is in fact, all of these things are in fact shared. So that really gets, I'm putting this out there just as a way, again, for people to think about when they approach an issue, who are they trying to get on board and how can they get to that substantial weight in two of the three to make a change happen. And there'll be different tactics and people are coming from different places in that spectrum. But I've found the 2 out of 3 rule is really important. The other thing, this is a graph I really like, and this is more from an advocate's perspective. And it's a spectrum of allies chart. You can see this in a lot of different places. And one of the things it really recognizes is that on any difficult issue, there's probably a core group of people on one side pushing for one outcome and a core group of people on the other side pushing for the other outcome. They're not merely, it's not merely opinion. They believe in the opposite and they will organize and work to make the opposite occur. And they will have, each side will have their active and passive allies, and then there are people in the middle. I'm bringing this out for a couple of reasons. I think in lots of settings, that active group, no matter what side it is on, you feel like you have to convert them, or the leading opponents, that you have to convert them to your point of view. And there's a high desire, I think, in many local political settings to have consensus. It would be better to move ahead if everybody could agree. But really, the process is sometimes you have to recognize, if it were merely a matter of explaining and get everybody on the same page, you probably would have had a different result already. So much of the process then is about moving people on the spectrum. And everybody, so this is just another way of thinking about it. Trying to move your more passive allies to active allies. Well, I should start off by saying, trying to identify who are potential active allies, who are passive allies or could be converted, who are people who are people that are neutral that could be moved into a more positive space. And so much of your work is actually trying to move your passive or active opposition to make them less opposed. So I just find this also to be a very useful framework in thinking about how to move people along. And I think and it's very easy to get locked into a hard discussion with somebody who's never going to agree with you. And really your audience is not just the middle, it's the active and passive allies as well. So my advice is always figure out who, collect your yeses first, try to build your own coalition first, recognize that some people aren't going to agree. And as you build the coalition, and as you develop more relationships, and you can use their relationships to reach out to other people, and who knows, if even if you're having fun, sometimes the passive or active opposition reduces just because they see what their neighbors care about, and that's actually an argument in itself to ease up a little bit. So you don't have to convince the most curmudgeonly opponent of the rightness of your cause. You really need to build your own side. And maybe I'm saying something obvious, but I found this also to be a very useful way to start thinking about, where do people in your community fit in this chart? What can you do to help move them to you? Recognizing that, again, if it were just rationality that moved people, we got the best arguments in the world for why we should have great walkable places. But people live in a world where there's a lot of things motivating them, and emotions matter, and their daily lives matter, and they may not actually have studied induced demand yet, like the rest of us traffic nerds have. So we just need to really take the time to talk, build relationships, and understand where people are coming from and be able to respond to them effectively. So with that, I am going to stop so that we can leave a lot more time for Q&A.
So thank you. I've got a few questions in the chat, but Teddy, as the person who put this together, I think you get priority on, and you said you had some questions to kick off the conversation.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks, Mike. I'm wondering, my own personal interest is how can we or I assist in building like public strength and build that coalition. I really appreciated your model, the triad of elected officials, public and agency officials. My own personal interest is in what can I do to maybe help educate the public and build the public strength. And I'm wondering if you could say something about messaging. It's like there's a lot of it, probably many of us here tonight are out there talking and promoting and lots of good ideas and good, even getting good policies approved. Can you say something specific about narrowing down the message and what makes a powerful message versus a weak message? Maybe even have a particular example from your experience in that regard.
And before you run into that, do you want me to stop your sharing, or do you?
Yeah, I can't find the button here. I don't know why.
Luckily, I have
Thank
a
you.
big red button all over to you.
Thankfully, you have that power.
Yes.
You know, I think I appreciate that. That's its own presentation, and I'll try not to let my answer go too long on this one. I think I was suggesting a little bit of it here is that messages, we often rely on messages that are rational and logical, or we think that that's what moves people.
Yeah.
And people really need to make an emotional connection to something, and they care about who the messenger is, right? Like if your friends believe in something that matters, and you're going to listen more. I almost want to start back a layer though, because I think sometimes we think that it's about just the message, if we can just figure out the right message. And I think we have enough experience here to know that changing streets, designs, adding bike lanes, removing parking, eliminating parking minimums, changing zoning, all of the things that I've said would be really great for improving health, equity, climate, and economic vitality of a city. Every one of them are some of the most difficult issues there are in city politics. And you know, again, I'm speaking from my own experience as an advocate and as a mayor. I think the starting point actually for this is, and I'm a really big believer in organizing as a tool, and I think that's what you're getting at, is, you know, so rather than start with message, think about organizing. And somebody once asked Cesar Chavez what was the secret to organizing, and he said, well, first I talk to one person, then I talk to another person, then I speak to another person. And it's really true. I'm also a really strong believer in the idea of public narrative. And I heartily recommend to you, you could Google public narrative, you could search the work of a person named Marshall Ganz, G-A-N-Z. He actually dropped out of Harvard, went to work for Cesar Chavez for years. And then when he finally returned to school, he ended up getting an advanced degree, and he now teaches organizing and is widely recognized for his role in helping the 2008 Obama campaign with its unique approach to organizing. His techniques are used by lots of folks. And one of the things he really believes in, something I really believe in, he actually came and trained in the state of Washington in the Sierra Club when I was active in the Sierra Club, is the idea of something called the one-on-one. And the one-on-one begins with you being able to tell your own story of who you are, why you care, and what you're working on. And that's the public narrative. And using that as an opportunity to connect with other people and hear their story of who they are, what they care about, and what they're working on. And he calls this the process of self, us, now. In Seattle, we called it you, me, us, now. Your story, my story, our story, and then now what can we work on together? And the reason I am going to this when you ask the messaging question is that this is where the message will develop, that will work in your community, because you will have your own story that shares your motivation and why you care. Mine is I just became I really care about climate, and I had kids, and I felt like I had to do more, and that led me to really work harder and deeper in these issues than I ever had before. And one thing led me to another, and I can give you lots of reasons why it's good, but that was my emotional core. And people want to know that. Why do you care? What are you getting involved in? And when you learn what's driving someone else, you'll be able to adapt and change the message you use with other people. So now I'm just going to say a couple more things about messaging, because I've also worked on campaigns. I've had pollsters, I've had focus groups, I've had tested messages. The thing about that is that takes a lot of money. And, your typical small nonprofit or community group is not really going to be able to test the message. So your message testing is going to have to be trial and error and seeing what works, one person at a time. And that's why I keep getting back to, that's why I get back to the one-on-one. And so I really don't, I wish I could tell you, this is the message. I mean, I thought on climate, it's the end of the world as we know it. And if we don't change, I thought that would win every argument, right? It turns out it doesn't, right? So I don't think we have a magic argument on any of these things. I think that people can become better messengers and better at message delivery. And I think that's the other major point I'm going to make, is that we often think that it's about the message, and if we have the right message, we'll convey people. But it's also about delivering the message to enough people, right, to penetrate. And I tend to think of it as a formula: message times delivery equals impact. Now, actually, I can't apply any numbers to anything in the formula, but the reason it's important from the formula is, if your message is worth nothing, it doesn't matter how many people you deliver it to. And if you got a great message and you don't deliver it to anybody, that also equals 0. So the trick is to, practice, experiment. Your focus groups are the people you talk to. Your focus groups are the small group meetings, the conversations on the corner. Those are your focus groups. And keep delivering, keep delivering, keep delivering. And you'll know if you're succeeding, because you'll look at that chart and how many people are now active in the organization. How many people are now active allies instead of passive allies? How many people are now have doubts? That's your metric here as to what's working or not. And if you got 5 followers on Twitter and you're going down to City Hall talking and nobody's going down with you, that's a problem, right? And you all know that. But if you got a group going with you, then you're doing okay on message. If you got 5 or 10 people meeting regularly, if you can get 25 people to a city council meeting, you're doing okay on messaging. And just lean into that a little bit more and keep working on that.
Great. That's a robust answer. Thank you, Mike.
Sorry, I think about
That's a lot there. Why don't I pass, Dan, because that was a pretty full response to that.
Well, we've had a number of things come through, and I'm going to kind of start with the broad strokes and go down to the narrow strokes. Do you see kind of the evolving set of mixed modes, e-bikes and things like that, influencing your message? And how do you think those are going to impact the transportation network as we move forward?
I wonder about that one too. I kind of have the same question. By the way, I was an early e-bike adapter, and I really got made fun of quite a bit, unfairly, I think, now as things have proven out. But I got it because I told you I'd started a nonprofit. My income had gone down quite low. The second car, an old beater, was no longer sustainable. So I got an electric bike and it was great. It was a car replacement. And I think a lot of people have discovered that. It's a great car replacement. And we know that I think 40% of the trips in the country are less than 2 miles. Like that's almost walking distance, and even greater percentage are less than 3 miles. So, and it just flattens the hills. So if you haven't gotten on one yet, it's absolutely fantastic. I think it really creates a challenge for the design of streets. Because I think there's kind of like obviously you have to separate pedestrians and vehicles from fast moving vehicles. And as you really start adding up the number of people on e-bikes or scooters or other, 15 to 20 mile an hour vehicles, you have to separate the pedestrians from them as well. So that I think becomes challenging, on more narrow streets or in downtown areas. And I guess the trade-off there is, can you start creating streets in which everybody's going 15 so that the cars and bikes and scooters are doing, can actually mix? Or do you need to start removing vehicles from more streets so that you can get the faster moving wheeled vehicles, the e-mobility things, away from the pedestrians, and I think that we're going to, what's the Jaws line? We're going to need a bigger boat. We're going to need a bigger bike lane here. It's not going to work anymore to have a 5-foot wide bike lane when people are passing each other, in that space, and they really need more room to coexist. And the rail trail that's 8 feet wide isn't going to work when you've got walkers and e-bikes and scooters. You're going to have to think about separating that. And you see that's happens in places where they've had to make those types of investments. So if the approach is we're going to keep all of the space we have for vehicles and try to squeeze everything else in, it's not going to work. I think they're great, by the way. I think e-bikes are great. I think the scooters are great, but we really have to give them more street space, and it can't be, you can't try to squeeze them and the pedestrians into the edges of the right of way.
One of the conversations we've had here is the challenge of asking police to do enforcement when traffic enforcement is obviously the thing that kind of sets citizens against police, versus how we build infrastructure designed to slow street.
Right.
And
Right.
you showed an example of one street with slowing and inline buses. Can you talk a little bit more about those topics?
Yeah, and I think that's and I think that's an issue that's become more salient as we gain a better understanding of well, first of all, nobody likes getting a ticket anyway, but it's become certainly more salient as we've seen the bias in enforcement and, the number of, who gets stopped and why. And that's true, by the way, for people walking or biking without a helmet. Anytime you look at the data, you see that it's often used for pretextual reasons. Or, it may be that for something like jaywalking, the places that are the toughest streets to cross are in the poorest neighborhoods. So that's also an unequal impact. I think there's some truth. We've also seen that with automatic enforcement, that the neighborhoods that may have the fastest streets with traffic cameras. So, the obvious answer, but it's the most expensive answer, is the infrastructure one. I know in the state of Washington, they've had red light cameras. In the city of Seattle, I think 50% of the red light camera revenue was spent on the pedestrian and bike improvements. We installed speed cameras around schools, but 100% of that revenue went to safe routes to schools, ideally to the school where the speeding occurred, right? Because the goal here would be to put in the infrastructure in which cars would naturally drive slower in the places where the speed cameras were installed. So I think that, I mean, it's a deeper problem, which is, you know, the revenue to make those types of investments, right? Curb bulb outs and, you know, the signal investments or raised crosswalks, all of the time, you know, horizontal deflection, you know, which are the, you know, different bulbs out. Raised crosswalks are brilliant, by the way, you know, in terms of slowing down cars. And we've seen a few of those. So there's lots of great design solutions, you know, and a city that can adopt the NACTO guidelines, National Association of City Transportation Officials, as opposed to the older guidelines, which, you know, were kind of more highway, you know, came from the highway engineers. NACTO comes from the city types. And, you know, another piece of information, it used to be in order to get money from the feds, you had to follow the AASHTO guidelines. Now you can follow the NACTO guidelines. That's one of the new changes. So that would be, I think, one of the most, you know, there's lots of things we can do, but getting the money to do it is the other big one. This last infrastructure bill, 70% of the money goes to the states under what's called formula funds. And the states have 100% discretion on how to spend it. Now, California is a lot better than other states, frankly. Like, you know, be glad you're not in Texas, right? Like they got another whole bunch of free highway lanes to build. But getting that money down to the city level where it can be used on these really granular type of improvements, I think is a challenge nationwide. And cities oftentimes don't have the taxing authority to do that. So it turned out that in Seattle, that camera revenue was a really robust funding source for local street improvements for safe routes to school. And it was about the only robust one we had because, you know, the property tax revenue we had, the limited gas tax revenue we got from the state, it couldn't keep up with bridges and road repair. So this is, I think the revenue issue is a really huge one. And I think you can build lots of support for granular improvements. People really support better walking conditions in their neighborhood if we could have the revenue to support it. And that would be a far better solution than enforcement. And automated enforcement has some advantages, obviously, but even the fees and fine issue is a serious one because of disparate impact that it can have. A few unpaid traffic fines on a person of low income could mean the loss of a vehicle, whereas, you know, for somebody with means, it's a, you know, it's a deterrent, but it's not going to damage their ability to get to work or take care of their daily needs.
And, you know, I try to be a conscientious driver, and I've made some horrendously bad decisions. So yes, it's because, and that's what we know. We know that people drive, you know, it's human nature. We drive to what feels safe in the conditions. And I think this is another one of these non-intuitive traffic things, is that having it feel a little unsafe is actually far safer. So the idea that there's more people around, or that everything, you know, can work for you, but the way we, you know, wide lanes, we paint the lines that you're going straight through, you've got a couple of lanes, and next thing you know, you're 5 or 10 miles over the speed limit and you didn't see the school sign. That's just, it's like a cruel trick, actually. Right? We design it so you feel good driving fast, and then we give you a ticket for it. Because why didn't you follow the rules? And it's just, we're not working with human nature here. And we should, and we really should. And that message that we have spent ourselves into a debt of unfunded maintenance and don't have a way out of that hole is certainly something we're hearing from a lot of sectors.
And people don't understand it either. One of the things when I was working, before I ran for mayor, I was working to get sidewalks in my neighborhood. And one of the things the city Department of Transportation people told me, well, we don't have money for residential streets. I mean, they said we don't have money for sidewalks. And they said, well, we don't even have money to maintain residential streets. And they said, we don't even know how much money it would take to maintain residential streets because there's no point in measuring it. We don't have enough money to maintain our arterials, much less all our bridges. So we'll maintain the arterials and the bridges. And that's all we're going to do. So stop coming to us for money for sidewalks for your neighborhood. You know, yeah, you got a park and a Boys and Girls Club and apartment buildings, and that didn't make any sense to me, right? And that's what actually led me deeper and deeper into regional and state funding issues. And like, where's the money going was my question. And trying to pass a local ballot measure to fund local things as well. But then I became mayor and I tell that story to people and nobody believed me. Like they couldn't believe that there wasn't enough tax money in Seattle, a very prosperous city, to even maintain its streets. They just actually couldn't believe it. And but it was true. It was true. There was the way the tax structure was set up and the amount of unfunded maintenance was so high, there was no chance we could pay for it. But it's not understood and nor accepted as real. And that turned out to be one of the hardest messaging problems there was there. So
you also mentioned parking minimums. What has the city of Seattle done to reduce parking, and what insight do you have on that?
Well, first of all, I think it's really interesting to see the way in which parking minimums, and I don't know what the situation is in Petaluma, but I've now become like, one of the best things you could do is just get rid of parking minimums entirely and let the business owner or business or property developer decide what they want to do. And I realize, to some people that sounds kind of nutty, right? Like, people have cars and they need to use them. But it's really interesting that oftentimes comes from, and I'm a single family homeowner, from people who've managed to convert their garage into something else and they park their car on the street. So everybody else has to park their car in a building so that I have room on the street for my car. So there's a little, that argument, by the way, isn't going to get you very far with most homeowners. But what I discovered was, so people can come at this from different ways or different motivations. I've seen towns which have realized that in order to meet the parking minimum for a new downtown building, they have to, that the owner, the potential developer of that building would have to buy an adjacent building, tear it down to get the surface parking, because they're not going to build structured parking. Cheaper to buy something and tear it down than build structured parking. That would be terrible for historic Petaluma, right? That's a business district that grew without parking minimums. Those businesses work, people park once and walk around. I've never been to downtown Petaluma, but the pictures on Google look great. I know it's got a historical designation. So that was a place that was built around walking. And what I found in Seattle, I remember, was approached when I was mayor by somebody saying, I wanted to open up a hardware store on Capitol Hill, which is one of our more dense residential neighborhoods. But he couldn't open it up because he couldn't secure 8 parking spaces, which is what the code required. I'm like, this guy wants to open a hardware store. If he thinks he can make it work without parking spaces, when did it become our business to shut him down at the city? So I think there's a really strong case, on the business side, to letting people do what they want to do. I think another approach to this is from the equity side, affordable housing. If you're trying to accommodate people of lower incomes, they probably don't own that many cars. Why are we giving them the same requirements as another multifamily housing development? Another approach we took in the city of Seattle. So you can start exempting people, right? You can start picking out areas and saying, this is a high pedestrian area, no parking minimums, because we don't want curb cuts. We don't want more cars driving. We want people to move around. Allowing shared parking, allowing somebody to satisfy their parking requirements by leasing somebody else's parking. Like, these are incremental measures. Eliminating parking minimums for affordable housing would be another one. And an approach we used in Seattle was we eliminated parking minimums for any place that had 15-minute bus service within a half mile or so. I forget the exact numbers, but frequent transit service areas. So as we invested more in transit, it meant more and more of the city was exempted from parking minimums. So it became a virtuous cycle there. Now, we were in a position where we were expanding transit. I suppose the opposite could occur, and if your transit got more poorly funded. But having said that, many cities are now spending time on those incremental portions. They're just eliminating them. And, city of Hartford, absolutely devastated by the removal of, I mean, Hartford was one of the wealthiest cities in the country once, but now it's a struggling city. They just completely eliminated parking minimums downtown because they'd rather people do something else with those parking lots that have already broken up their downtown. So it's actually one of the simplest things you could do to increase walkability and economic vitality in a place. And it's particularly troubling when we impose it on housing when, like, I don't know how we got to the point where every car has to have a roof over its head when so many of our neighbors don't have a roof over their head.
I've got a couple of a few technical questions about Seattle in the in-queue, but I think I'd like to actually loop back around to kind of in America Walks, the America Walks hat of yours. Talk a little bit about what do we have to do to make a neighborhood that is accessible? How far will people walk for amenities? What are those metrics like?
This is where now I've got to be a little more of the generalist and not the expert. So I think that we sometimes don't recognize just that quality of the walking experience can carry you. Well, we know this. The quality of the walking experience can carry you along for miles, right? Like if you've ever vacationed somewhere where you've had that experience. So let's think about what those qualities are. First of all, other people is probably the single most important one, unless you're hiking in the wilderness, but this is a different thing. We're talking about a walkable neighborhood. And a lot of storefronts. By the way, and now I'm gonna get really arcane here. Whenever we require parking in a new building, so much of the ground floor is taken up by the parking entrance and the parking ramps to get to the basement parking, et cetera, that you don't have the room for those narrow, deep storefronts that define a great classical neighborhood. So that's another example of how, and then you've got a 2-car wide curb cut that you have to navigate on foot, right? Like look at the old gracious buildings you love, and they were all built before parking minimums existed, right? They have a great presence on the street. There are multiple doorways, multiple storefronts, and they're brought right up to the street side frequently, right up to the sidewalk. There's not a setback, like at the fast food restaurant with the little grassy area in the parking lot. Like that's not a walkable place. Even if it has a sidewalk, you're not going to want to walk there next to a 40-mile-an-hour road in kind of this barren place. You'll walk for hours and hours though in this other setting. So that type of granularity of uses, lots of uses, buildings brought up to the street edge, not requiring all of the padding between places that separate places, it adds up. And we didn't actually need a guidebook for that. You didn't need a master's in urban planning. People just seem to know how to build places just by like building one building after another and replacing one after the other. All of the best places we had were before anybody discovered Euclidean zoning, right? Like you laid out the streets, you said where the parks wanted to go, and people started building. And when the business district expanded, well, maybe some residences got torn down for it. And when it got popular, maybe a rooming house replaced the single family house, or an apartment building replaced something. And we had cottages, we had cottage courts and had all sorts of things. So we certainly should care about earthquake proof and energy conservation and things like that. But I don't know how we got so hung up on what use went where that we stopped trusting people to do the thing they've done for generations, which is build places. And that's where we all visit, right? We all go to visit the place that was built before zoning codes, that was built by humans and have all of these wonderful human elements to them. We just want to be there. Or we go to Disneyland, in which they studied those places and created this place where you can't drive, where you can only walk, and they got transit in it. And that has that feeling, right? That's where we go, to places that feel like that. That's why we all love college too, man. Like if you went to college, that was the one place where all your friends and all your activities were within walking distance of each other. Maybe that's why we have such fond memories, besides being young and full of hope and energy. Yeah.
Oh, to be young again. I don't know if I'll ever. I do want to be respectful of your time, but I think we can go on for a bit. It has been an hour.
I can go a little bit. I can absolutely go a little longer if people are up for it.
Excellent. Well, I'm up for it. And I'm also by back channel informed that we have a council workshop on Monday evening about eliminating parking minimums. Maybe we should coordinate something for that, just possibly. So an earlier question that I kind of skipped over asked about what the current lane widths in Seattle are and what steps were taken to kind of create edge of road friction. And then we have a question further down about converting car parking to parkettes and creating outs and those kind of neighborhood spaces.
You know, that we ended up doing I don't know if we called them parkettes. I'm not trying to remember what we called them, but they turned out to be really popular. And it was inspired by the parking day movement, in which people would, and it was an act of civil disobedience, kind of, sort of. They would feed the meter, and then they would take over a parking space and build a little park there. And we ended up developing, in the city, we developed a process for doing so. And there were other rules out there that were really interesting too. I don't know what California rules were, but it turned out that the Washington State Liquor Control Board required that a sidewalk cafe that got drinks was attached to the building, because the server couldn't cross the sidewalk carrying a drink. That was the liquor. So we got that, like you discover these challenges. So we actually got the Liquor Control Board to change that rule, and that allowed us to start building the parklets, in the parking spaces. Our program didn't tie it to any specific business. It had to be something that was available to everyone on the street. We also got food trucks going, and that had all sorts of health department regulations. There was also a situation where I think somebody in the city went and gave a ticket to some dad because he built some type of kid sandbox and play structure in the parking area, and he got a ticket, and the dad went to the Seattle Times. So we started a stakeholder group on what was acceptable in the right of way. One other story that's interesting in this too is the degree to which, kind of going back to messaging and process for getting things done. In one neighborhood called Lake City Way, relatively early in my term, SDOT, the department, came forward with a plan for a 4-to-3 conversion, which had bike lanes. Well, this created a real amount of backlash in the community, and there were town halls. Lots of people were arguing. I was trying to explain that this was a corridor that actually had a lot of car-to-car accidents, because that's what happens on those 4-way streets. People weave to avoid the left turners and then weave to avoid the right turners. They're going too fast. Very unsafe environment for a pedestrian crossing the street. But they all thought it was about bike lanes because they saw a bike lane. And by the way, I rode a bike. And so that obviously I had gone to that street and said, put in a bike lane here. And that was outrageous. So everybody was really mad at the city and mad at me about that. But we did it, and the cars slowed down, and the same number of cars moved through, and the number of accidents decreased, and it was far safer for pedestrians, and it all worked out. But about a few months later, after that all went through, a city inspector gave a ticket or told a coffee shop owner that the bike rack that she had built on her sidewalk, because the city couldn't give her one because it didn't have enough money. So she had hired an artist, gotten a unique bike rack put on the sidewalk, and was given a ticket. And now the department was angry at me. Now the neighborhood was angry at the city too. And I remember our traffic engineer came in, a guy named Dong Ho Chang, and I said, Dong Ho, why don't you just like get rid of a parking space and put her bike rack in the street? And he said, it's already done, Mayor, like he's already on it. And the lesson for me was when it's the city doing something to a neighborhood, it's bad. And when the neighborhood asks for it, it's good. If I had shown up in that neighborhood and suggested converting parking spaces to bike parking, they would have lost their, collective, what, because the biking mayor is coming down to change their neighborhood against their consent. But when it was a small business person whose investment in an artistic bike rack was being removed because of some arcane regulation about sidewalk width, now we had to respond. So long-winded way of saying, figure out how to get a stakeholder group of residents together to talk about, are there more creative ways we can use our rights of way to support local businesses, to support parklets, to support movable food trucks, and go from there, because people actually want them. And if you can have, we go back to that chart, elected official, agency, public. If you start with the public, everything works better. Everything works better when you start with the public.
Yes, there are a couple of kind of bubbling around tactical urbanism projects in the awareness of my periphery, and I'm now fired up to try to execute some of those more.
I think it's great, and you can do lots of tactical urbanism with the permission of the city, right? Yeah. With the understanding that it's if you have a responsive city, it's just like, yeah, we can do that for a day or two. Yeah, or a week, we can just try it out. But if it's the city coming down to do that,
right,
it's just different. It's just different than when the community itself can organize to make something happen. And by the way, in that three-way chart, I was saying everybody has power, but it is a democracy, and all power is supposed to flow from the public. So if the public can organize to move elected officials, and then you get 2 out of 3 that way against recalcitrant people, or the public can organize and an enlightened staff person can help get you over the top with an elected official who thinks it's going to be politically unpopular or dumb, right? So I think it all starts at the public level, ultimately.
Yeah, I think too that staff people who are willing to stick their necks out know that they have to feel like they're going to be supported when they do so, because if we let them dangle in the wind when they make an unpopular decision, we lose our staff. They're by nature going to be conservative.
Yeah, and I think it's in the nature of agency officials to recognize that they really are civil servants. I mean, I've always found that there to be a very strong recognition from public employees that they're serving the city, and that means they're supposed to be cautious sometimes about doing things and not trying to impose what they want. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, with that, I think I've run out of my questions and the questions that have come through the chat. Thank you very, very much for spending time with us this evening and inspiring us.
I hope it was good. I really appreciate if you liked it. Thank you very much. And if you have thoughts on how to, thank you for the thumbs up. And if you have thoughts on how to make it better, shoot me a line. And if you were, ever strategizing about how to do something, this is something we want to help. And I gotta say, man, I looked at Zillow and Petaluma. You guys look like you got a cool town, honestly. I don't think I'm moving to California, but I just had to know. It's a cool town.
I moved here 14 years ago now. Holy cow. And decided I don't ever want to move again. So yeah, it's about making this my home.
That's cool. That's
Cool.
cool. Thank you,
All right.
everyone.
Hopefully see some of you tomorrow. We'll also be coordinating about some stuff for Monday night, maybe. And thank you once again, Mike. Thank you, Teddy, for coordinating.
Oh, I just realized I'm tossing into the chat the link to our webinar. So really, if you want to dig deeper into the land use walkability connection and the data, you'll like this.
I think I'm going to have to carve out time for that, because I really like as you pointed out, there are a lot of conversations about lost time and all of those other things that impact why we need more lanes, and all of those other health numbers are good things to bring into the conversation and pull the externalities out. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, all.
Thanks, Teddy.